All right. Darwin, so this is the first time that I'm doing this here, obviously. So first, I do want to introduce you. You have been providing a lot of excellent arguments online for the existence of God. One of them recently is the rational argument for the existence of God. And I was wondering if you could first just kind of go through the syllogism here.
Yeah, sure. So you want me to explain the rational argument for God, is that correct? So, do you want the backstory of how I even came to this argument? Are you interested in that at all? All right. So, the way that this argument came to me was because I was talking to Benjamin Blake Speed Watkins, and we were talking about morality. He's a high tier atheist philosopher, and he believes that you cannot get morality without rationality. And he told me that reality is rational. He said literally, reality equals rationality. And I thought that that seemed really strange because I said, Ben, doesn't rationality require a mind? And he said, no, it doesn't, obviously, because I'm an atheist. And I said, well, normally rationality requires a mind. And he had just finished explaining to me earlier in the conversation the difference between non rationality and irrationality. He had explained to me that to be non rational is to not be able to aim towards reason. So things like rocks or maybe a baby crying, these things are non rational. Whereas to be irrational is to be aware of rationality, to be aware of reason, and to be deviating away from it, either by accident or on purpose or just neglect. But you have to be aware rationality in the first place in order to be irrational. And so once Ben said that reality is rational, I said, well, Ben, if it requires a mind to be irrational, then it has to require a mind to be rational because that's the whole thing about being irrational. It requires a mind. And you're talking about rationality, which is, basically the fulfillment of being irrational. So if it requires a mind to be irrational, it has to require a mind to be rational. It's got to,
Mhm.
because it's the same standard. So if you have to have a mind to be irrational, you have to have a mind to be rational. And so that really got me thinking, if you have to have a mind to be rational and we have rationality, then that means rationality requires a mind. And I this might be the strongest argument for God that I've ever seen. So that's kind of how this argument came about. The
So
the short
before
version,
we
anyway.
before we push into the syllogism, which I do want to get into, and sorry I'm moving stuff around. I was testing like the sound in a few different ways. But before we get into the syllogism, so if I was thinking, if I was an atheist, where I would start in trying to dismantle this argument or this argument for rationality is I would say that rationality is evolved. So it's rationality is simply a product of evolution, since the human mind and everything that exists is material. Again, from a naturalist perspective, if everything that exists is material, the human mind and body all evolved. Therefore, the byproduct of human evolution is the human mind, and therefore, whenever we're using the human mind in ways that line up with reality, that's kind of like what we're talking about whenever we're talking about rationality. So, why would
Yeah.
evolution maybe not be a good explanation for the existence of rationality?
Well, it seems like a really good objection on its face, but I think in order for your audience to understand why it isn't, I need to go through the argument first and then come
Okay.
back to, because if I just try to explain the problem with it, I'm pretty much going to have to explain the entire argument anyway. So,
Yeah, no, that's fair. Well, go through the argument then as as best you can here. I know you've written about it extensively.
mhm. Yeah, okay. And if I am not clear on anything, just try to listen to it with fresh ears if you can. And if I'm not clear on anything, or if I don't define something that you think needs to be defined or whatever, just go ahead and stop me. And hopefully we can get all of that cleared up. I'd like for this to be communicated as clearly as possible. So, all
Yeah.
right.
I'll pretend I've not read the argument. I haven't heard it yet. What is the
Yeah,
rational argument for the existence of God?
awesome. So the argument goes like this: if the property of rationality exists, then God must exist. Rationality, or the property of rationality, exists, therefore God must exist. Okay, so it's pretty simple syllogism, and before I really start to explain the argument, I want to explain what transcendental reasoning is, because this is ultimately a transcendental argument. And a lot of people don't understand transcendental reasoning at all. And that's because it's difficult to wrap your mind around. And it's also because most people are terrible at explaining transcendental reasoning.
Hmm.
But I've given it a lot of thought, and I think I can explain it very simply. So, when we're doing transcendental reasoning, what we're doing is we're asking ourselves, what must be the case in order for the thing that we observe to be the case? Okay. So let's think about an engine, for example, or a car, right? If we know how a car works, we know that in order for the engine to turn on, it must be the case that the starter is working. Okay.
Hmm.
So then from that, it follows, if we get into our vehicle and we turn the key and the engine turns on, it necessarily follows that we have a working starter. At least it worked that time. Maybe the next time it won't. But the way that you could formulate this argument is you could say, if my engine turns on, then my starter works. My engine has turned on, therefore my starter works. Or you could say, another way of putting that would be to say a necessary precondition for the possibility of my engine turning on is for me to have a working starter. My engine has turned on, therefore I have a working starter. Okay.
Follow that.
Um, yeah, it's pretty simple, right?
Hmm.
Now, if we think about this when it comes to arguments that have to do with transcendentals, like for God, what we're really doing is we're looking at possible worlds, okay? And we're saying, what kind of world must we be in order to get the stuff that we see in our world? Okay. So, for example, imagine if there's a world with no space. Okay. Like it's a space.
I don't know if I have the mental capacity to imagine that type of world, but I'll grant the premise.
It's like a one-dimensional
Mhm.
world, right?
Okay, fair enough. Okay, I can conceive of a one-dimensional world. Okay, I got you.
Hmm. Right. So, in a one-dimensional world, could electricity exist?
I don't think so.
Right. And that's because electrons need space in order to move, right? So if you don't have any space to move, from one electron to the other, or from one atom to the other, I should say, then, right? Because electricity is the movement of electrons from one atom to the other. So you could say that a necessary precondition for the of electricity is a world where space exists, right? So, and then you say, okay, electricity exists in my world, so therefore my world must have the dimension of space, something like that.
Okay, yeah, I follow you there.
So, yeah, so that means that any world that doesn't have space as part of its metaphysic, right, as part of its reality, cannot generate electricity by definition.
Okay, no, I mean all that follows. All that follows.
Yeah. So that's basically what transcendental reasoning is we're asking ourselves what must be the case in order to get this thing that we're observing. So I see electricity. It must be the case based on what electricity is that we live in a world with space because of what electricity is. Okay.
Well,
So
thank you
now,
for a better education on transcendental truths, because I definitely think about transcendental truths, and we think about transcendental truths whenever we think about the moral argument or something of that nature. But
yeah.
that's a brilliant expression of it. So no, it's good.
Well, I've been thinking about this for years, and it always bugs me how poorly it's articulated by most apologists. So I try to explain it very simply so that people can get it, because once you get it, it's very powerful. But it's just really difficult to explain it simply, apparently. I don't know. Hopefully, I've done a good job of it today, but
So you've
um,
established transcendental truths, and
mhm.
transcendental truths do then exist. I would suppose then, even from a naturalist perspective, based off what you've provided for transcendental truths, a naturalist could agree then with the existence of transcendental truths in your example of electricity and it needing a world with space in order for it to exist. So how does that all tie back into your rational argument for the existence of God and why naturalism then could not explain properly or be sufficient properly um, for rationality to exist?
Yeah, right. So there's a lot of unpacking that I'm going to have to do here.
I
So,
know there is.
yeah. So the first thing that I feel I should probably point out is this dichotomy between atheism and theism. And maybe I shouldn't say theism, maybe that's not exactly correct, but what I mean is either God or not God. Because theism is a personal God, and you could have an impersonal God, like a deistic sort of God. So maybe I shouldn't say atheism versus theism, but the dichotomy is either there's a God or there's no God. All right. That's a true dichotomy. And when we talk about what God is a mind. If God is anything, God is a mind,
Mhm.
right? Because if there's no mind fundamentally that's responsible for our world or our reality, then atheism is true. Full stop, in my view. I don't know how you can say that there's no mind responsible for everything and atheism be false. It's got to be a mind. So
Follows.
ultimately, yeah, ultimately, when we talk about God, we're talking about a mind. And a lot of people don't put it that way, but that's the only real way to put it, right? In my view, I think it's just totally obvious. Because otherwise, what the heck are we even talking about when we talk about God? It's got to be a mind. If it's anything,
We're talking about a weird man in the sky, a fictitious sky daddy, right? Who just
still a mind.
sits up there and judges us. No, I no,
Hmm.
I agree. I think that atheists do often underestimate what the potential intelligence of an entity must be that created the laws which govern the universe, or that designed DNA or any of the
Yeah.
complexities of life.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about the design argument, it's saying there's a mind that has designed our world, right? That's why the design argument is an argument for God, because to design something is to do something with intentionality. So if you're designing something that requires a mind, all of the arguments for God are ultimately tapping into what we know about what minds do and saying minds do this thing, and the thing that we're observing in the world seems like it should come from a mind, so we should think that our world comes from a mind versus naturalism, which would say that it comes from not mind. If you actually pay attention to all the arguments for God, they're ultimately tapping into that idea that the world comes from a mind.
Mhm.
So,
Um, to which a naturalist might object that all of those arguments are God of the gaps arguments, right? They might
sure,
object that
but that's
just
not my
because
point.
we don't understand how something can exist without a mind, that doesn't then therefore then follow that it came from a mind. You could either respond to that, or
Yeah.
if you want to kind of unpack some of your premises a little bit more
Hmm.
deeply, because I know that you unpack them extensively in writing. So your choice on which direction to take it from here.
Right now that these arguments for God prove God. I'm just pointing out that all of these arguments are saying that there's a mind that's responsible for everything. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about God, is where we are saying that there is a mind responsible for everything. That's what we're saying. And so either it's mind that's responsible for everything, or it's not mind. So if
Hmm.
everything, it's one exhaustive dichotomy, okay? Meaning you've proven minds,
Wait, you're saying if you prove not mind as the origin, then
not
talking about mind?
yeah, like if you disprove atheism, if you can prove that the universe does not arise from a
Hmm.
not mind source, then you've proven that theism is
Oh yeah,
true.
okay,
So if
yeah,
you can
of course. So
disprove
at least
atheism,
theism, you at
you
least
prove.
prove that there's an existence of a mind.
Yes.
The book that led me back to faith, back over a dozen years ago now, was by a quantum physicist, and he uses the kind of the argument from consciousness and the argument from mind. But his book was Quantum Physics, Near Death Experiences, Eternal Consciousness, Religion, and the Human Soul. Now, I'm not going to go into what he wrote because that's not kind of the purpose of our conversation, nor would I say that all these years later that I have a good ability to reflect on it. But he uses mind as an axiom, and somewhat in the way that your argument from rationality does. But I do next then want you to kind of expand as much as you can on either or both premise one and premise two of the argument.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've just been basically laying some things out on the table that are going to come in later on. So let's talk about premise one a bit. So once again, just to remind everybody, it says if the property of rationality exists, then God must exist. So why is that the case? Well, let's talk about what rationality is really quickly, and define some terms. So rationality is essentially the activity of a mind that is trying to be in line with reason. Okay. And by reason, I mean capital R reason. Um, and by capital R reason, what I mean is basically the correct way to reason. So uh, think about it like morality. Okay. So when we talk about morality, we have this idea that there's this objective standard of behavior that we ought to be fulfilling. And when we say someone has been moral, we are saying that their action was in line with that standard. And when we say someone is immoral, we're saying that their action was not in line with that objective standard. Well, capital R reason is the standard for reasoning rather than for moral or immoral action. So when we talk about capital R reason, I'm saying that there's a standard for reasoning. And then when someone is rational, they are reasoning in line with that standard. And when someone is being irrational, they are deviating from that standard. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, yeah, I follow all that.
Okay. So that's what capital R reason is. That's what rationality exists. Or sorry, that's what rationality is. And basically the argument is that if the property of rationality exists, then God must exist because rationality can only come from a mind. So I have three syllogisms, three proofs that rationality can only come from a mind. And if I can prove that rationality can only come from a mind, that's where rationality comes from, is it comes from minds. And atheism starts without a mind, then that means that atheism would be saying that rationality came from not a mind because there was no mind. And then all of a sudden we got rationality. But I prove in my argument that rationality requires a mind in order to exist. That's what rationality is. It requires the mind to exist. So if rationality exists, then God must exist. Think of it think about it this way. There's an analogy that I give in my argument, which is that it's a tree analogy, and it says that in order for a tree to exist, water must exist. Because if there's no water, and trees require water in order to exist, if there's no water, you can't get any trees. Okay, so if you start your metaphysic off, if you start a reality off with no water or no ability to get water, you can never get a tree. So if you
course.
see a tree, you know that you're in a universe that can create water necessarily. Okay, so um, I can get into some of the syllogisms that I use in order to prove premise one.
Like just backing up a little bit, you did mention a few minutes ago that you have like three different syllogisms, I think, for kind of proving capital R rationality exists. I believe that's what you said.
Yeah.
Yeah, knock them out, man.
Okay. So the fact that rationality requires a mind is that irrationality and non-rationality are two distinct things, and irrationality requires a mind by definition, because that's what distinguishes it from non-rationality. So let me unpack that a little bit.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is there's an obvious difference between non-rationality and irrationality. A rock can never be irrational because a rock doesn't have a mind and it doesn't have any idea about capital R reason. So a rock just kind of is. It's a non-rational thing. It's not trying to think. It doesn't know what reason is. It's just being a rock. That's all it's doing.
Right.
So
right.
rocks are non-rational.
Like my table, any material object that that doesn't have a brain or anything like that, or nervous system or cells. That any material object, they're non-rational. They're not irrational. They're not rational. They're just non-rational. I got you.
Yeah, exactly. Non-rational. But then there are people, and even you and I at times, there are people that are irrational, right? So yeah, so there's a clear difference between something that is non-rational and something that is irrational. And what it means to be irrational, once again, is to have knowledge of capital R reason, and either you're trying to be reasonable, or you're trying to make a good argument, or you're trying to be rational, and you're failing by accident, right? Just like you might try to be moral, but
Mhm.
knowledge, you just don't care. So you're just flaunting it. So you can be doing it on purpose or by accident. And I think there's another option too. But that's what the nature of irrationality is it's where you're aware of capital R reason and you're missing the mark.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, I think just
Yeah.
like human passions or passions of the human heart, or just people wanting to gorge themselves, and yeah, it can be different sins, but it could be a lot of different things. It could be spending your money, unwisely. There's a rational way to do it. You should rationally be saving, but instead you're buying a bunch of stuff online. There's a million different behaviors you get into, but I get the idea.
Rationality. In order to be irrational, you have to have a mind that is able to understand capital R reason. So irrationality requires a mind. And so from that, it follows that rationality also requires a mind, because both irrationality and rationality are part of the same standard, right? So whatever is necessary for one part of the standard must also be necessary for the other. And a way that I explain this is if you think about a football game, right? One team wins and the other team loses. But in order for one team to lose, it has to meet certain requirements initially that the team that won also had to meet. Okay. So whatever the team that lost had to do in order to get into that stadium, they had to be part of a league, they had to have a certain number of players, they had to have certain equipment, all of those necessary preconditions for them to get.
Mhm.
In order to be, if you have to be in the same league in order to play the same team, and in order to have a chance of winning or losing, in the same way, you have to have a mind. If it requires a mind to be irrational, then it necessarily must require a mind to be rational. So that means that rationality and irrationality both require a mind. They both have to require a mind. And I think I prove, as long as I can prove that irrationality requires a mind, and I think I do that by showing the sharp distinction between what it is to be irrational versus non rational, that proves what irrationality is, and that it requires a mind. And because irrationality and rationality are both part of the exact same standard, the standard is moving either towards or away from capital R reason, they both must necessarily require. And so from that, it follows that irrationality and rationality both require a mind in order to exist. So rationality cannot exist without a mind. Okay?
Still
Does
following
that
it.
make sense?
Yeah, it does. I still do, and if you sufficiently explained this and I missed it, and I'm sorry, but I still do, because I still think if I were an atheist, I would still say that, hey, I get where you're coming from with transcendental truth. I get where you're coming from with rationality, and that there are choices that are rational, choices which are irrational, and you know I, I get that. I can see that through the universe. But if I were an atheist, I might say, as an atheist, I still think that mind developed from evolution. So why can't I then say, so if the brain developed from evolution, why
Yeah.
can't I then say that the mind and rationality are the byproduct of natural forces, even if there was non-mind that led to mind?
Hmm.
Mind still now exists because of a biological natural process. What's
Yeah.
the
Well,
problem
that
with that line of thinking?
the problem is that it doesn't understand the nature of the argument, right? So imagine I prove to you that you can only get trees if water exists.
Yeah.
Okay. And then you say, well, what if you got a tree and there's no water?
Okay.
That would be a contradiction, right? Because either trees require water to exist in their reality or they do not. So if you agree with me, if I can prove that trees require water in order to exist, and then you then say, here's a reality where there's a tree and it came about without any water, that would be a contradiction because either trees require water to exist or they do not require water to exist. So if you see a tree and trees require water, then you know that you're in a universe with water, even if you don't see the water, because
No.
trees require water to exist. So trees can't come about without water, and rationality cannot come about without mind.
Okay.
So if you start in a universe without mind, then rationality comes about without mind because you go from no mind to mind. So that's exactly what this argument shows cannot be the case, right? Like if you and I both agree that you have to have a starter in order for your engine to turn on, and then all of a sudden you're saying, well, what if the engine just turned on without a starter? Well, then I would say, well, I thought we just agreed that you have to have a starter in order for the engine to work. So if I can prove that an engine cannot turn on without a starter, if I can actually prove that is the case, and that's the point of these three syllogisms, is to prove that rationality cannot come from something other than a mind. So if I can prove that a starter can only come from an engine, or sorry, if I can prove that an engine can't turn on without a starter, and we have an engine that has turned on, and you agree that I've proven that an engine can't turn on without a starter, then it really doesn't make sense for you to say, well, okay, you proved that engines can't turn on without a starter, but what if the engine turned on without a starter? Do you see the problem?
Well, I think that my theoretical atheist self is seeing your point, and gonna have to turn to Jesus then in this case. Did
Well,
we hit all your syllogisms though? Because I don't want to keep you forever. I know that you have a wife and a baby. I'm sure the baby's asleep and
yeah,
all
I
that.
mean, I only kind of like went over part of premise one.
Okay.
um,
Well,
um,
let's
uh,
dive deeper then into anything you have on premise one or premise two.
yeah, because there's a lot here, honestly. I'm probably going to end up turning this into a book, and I think it could be a pretty decent sized book, at least three
Hmm.
to 600 pages, because you could actually infer a lot of things about God from this argument. I believe there's a lot to explore when it comes to this argument.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
anyway,
So Darwin to Jesus does have all of this in a post on X. He makes these threads on X, and will make sure that I
it's also on my
get that
Substack.
here.
Yeah.
But I do want you then to go expand on this argument. As much as you can. Any of the syllogisms, anything that we haven't touched on. I just want you to tackle them.
Yeah, so there's still a lot to go through.
Yeah, I know we don't have to hit
I do want
we
to.
don't have to hit all 600 pages.
We're gonna hit it all.
Or
We're gonna be here for 6 hours,
like I remember,
and I
I
want
know
you
I
all to
read this
strap
one
in.
morning, like your longer form argument, and it took me, I think, pretty close to 2 hours. I think there was a lot there. So
Yeah, yeah. Was it? I'm curious. Was it easy or difficult to understand?
I got most of it as I was going through it, but I can't say that it all sunk. Like I can't say that I could
Okay.
right, but I got it as I was reading it. But I've also been reading a lot by Dr. Jolin and a lot of other people who write on the topics of faith and science right now. So my mind might have been better in a place to get the philosophy. But I know one of the other critiques it would be like a less thoughtful critique where an atheist might say something like, "Oh, well, your argument would be like me then saying that if gravity exists, then the flying spaghetti monster exists, and gravity exists, and therefore the flying spaghetti monster exists." That's another less mature way that an atheist might tackle all that.
Do you want me to respond to that?
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead and beat that up.
Sure. So what they're doing is they're basically just relabeling what God is with something silly. But then you say, okay, well, what are the characteristics of a flying spaghetti monster, right?
Hmm.
Does a flying spaghetti monster necessarily flying spaghetti monster, you know, have a mind? Like ultimately, are you just calling God, renaming God the flying spaghetti monster to make God sound silly, or are you talking about something completely different from God? And they're not really going to want to answer those questions because they're just playing semantics, right? They're just kind
Then
of
they'll rate
inserting.
things, focus on an easier target. That's usually what I would
Yeah,
do.
they want to insert a silly sounding word or whatever or phrase into God and then make your argument sound silly, but your argument is talking about God. So if whatever they're inserting is really just literally the same thing as God, it's just a different expression or it's just renaming God to something silly, then nothing has actually changed. They're just trying to make it sound silly, but they're not seriously engaging with the argument.
Yeah. I'm
So,
opening your thread here, so I'm not being disrespectful. I just want to make sure I hit on anything that we haven't touched on.
well, there's a lot we haven't touched on. Let me go through some stuff here.
Yeah.
So, So premise one was if the property of rationality exists, then God must exist. I gave one syllogism for that. I do want to, which is the normativity argument, and what it says is that rationality is normative. That's premise one. There are correct and incorrect ways to reason. All right, and we've talked about that so far quite a bit. I think the normativity, and for anybody that doesn't know what normativity is, it's when you have an obligation to do something. Okay. So when somebody makes a mistake in their reasoning and you realize that they've made a mistake, you feel like you should correct them. And you feel like if you do correct them, they should not make the mistake again and that they should own up to the mistake. Like everybody that's
Yeah,
listening to me
no, it's
right
like
now.
important in marriage and friendships.
Well, it depends on the sort of person you're married to, but yeah, that's kind of a different
Sure, but I'm saying like
conversation.
if I do something
Yeah,
my wife doesn't like, and
yeah.
then she's mentioned that this is something that bothers her, and then I keep going on and doing it,
Hmm.
that means I'm violating her norms and disrespecting her for no reason. So
Right.
I mean,
Yeah, so what I'm trying to get at here though is everybody that's listening to me right now, they're all listening to what I'm saying and they're asking themselves, does that make sense? Is that a non sequitur? Is he correct about this? Right? They're wondering as I'm going through this whether or not I am being rational. And if I'm not, they would feel very compelled to tell me, hey, this wasn't rational. You made a mistake here. This is a non sequitur. This is this error, right? you know.
mhm,
Um, so the point is that rationality is normative. Okay, we feel like there's an obligation to be rational, to be in accordance with the standard of capital R reason. Just like we feel like we have an obligation to be in accordance with the moral standard. When somebody steals from you, you feel that they've done something wrong, and you feel like they ought not have done that. And just like when somebody says 2 plus 2 equals 5, you feel like they have also done something wrong with their reasoning and they ought not reason that way. And so you feel compelled to correct them.
mhm.
All right. So that's premise one, rationality is normative. Premise two is that norms do not exist in mindless systems. Physical causes just are, but they are not right or wrong. So what I'm saying is that because uh, because of the nature of normativity, it can't exist in a mindless system because normativity is about stuff. All right. Let's well, I'll read the conclusion, then I'll get into the justifications.
Yeah.
So therefore, the existence of rational norms requires the existence of minds. That's the conclusion. Let me read the whole thing again, real quick. So
Yeah.
rationality
Yeah, I have
is
this up.
normative.
Sorry, go
Sorry.
ahead. Sorry, go. I'm gonna go ahead. Sorry.
One, rationality is normative. There are correct and incorrect ways to reason. Premise two, norms do not exist in mindless systems. Physical causes just are, they are not right or wrong. Conclusion, therefore, the existence of rational norms requires the existence of minds. All right. So for premise one, the justification is that rationality isn't just about what happens in someone's brain, it's about whether the reasoning was right or wrong, valid or invalid, coherent or incoherent. When we call something rational, we are not just describing it, we are evaluating it. This is what makes rationality normative. It operates according to standards. For example, if someone commits a logical fallacy, like affirming the consequent, they have reasoned incorrectly. If someone draws a valid inference from true premises, they have reasoned correctly. These are not just observations, they are judgments. They involve evaluating whether reasoning conforms to logical norms. So remember that standard I was talking about? That's what I mean by a logical norm.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
norms,
I got you.
yeah, and norms are not reducible to mere physical descriptions. You can't say, this neuron fired in the wrong way and mean that in a normative sense because brain states don't have truth conditions. Only reasoning does. All right. So what I'm saying is that normativity entails a mind because it's about something. I think I'm going to get more into. Let me read premise two, and I might come back to that. So premise two: norms do not exist in mindless systems. Physical causes just are; they are not right or wrong. So this premise is grounded in a basic distinction between facts and norms. A rock falls due to gravity. A chemical reaction occurs when you mix two substances. None of these things are right or wrong. They just are. They follow physical laws, but they do not conform to or deviate from normative standards. So there's nothing that is saying, "Hey, rock, you ought to have fallen this way." The rock doesn't fall bad when it rolls one way versus another or something like that. Rocks don't have any sort of obligation to, like obey the laws of physics or something. They just do, right?
Hmm.
So you don't say that a rock fell incorrectly or that photosynthesis made a bad inference. Physical processes have no direction towards truth or falsehood, no awareness. That's a key term. They have no awareness of right or wrong. They are not aiming at anything. They're just governed by blind causality. So they're just being affected and they don't have awareness, right? They're being caused, things are acting on them, but they are not acting on things. That's kind of like the difference between a mind and something without a mind, is that minds kind of like act upon other things instead of just being acted upon by the external world or whatever. But anyway,
Yeah, they
but ration
change reality before them, or they impact it in one way or another.
yeah, yeah. Um, so
They can exert
so
influence.
what's that?
They can exert influence within
Hmm.
where they exist.
Yeah. So you don't say that a rock fell incorrectly or that, sorry, I think I just read that. But rational norms like the law of non-contradiction or the principle of sufficient reason do have truth directed structure. They describe not just how we do think, but how we ought to think. That's what these things do. The principle of sufficient reason, the capital R reason. These are describing how we ought to think. And norms like that only make sense in the context of minds that can be aware of rules, aim at truth, and evaluate their own reasoning. So basically, what requires a mind, because the nature of normativity requires a mind to be, in order for you to have normativity, it has necessarily it requires a mind.
It
So
therefore, you've cut out a little
does
bit
that
there.
make
It
sense?
therefore follows that.
It therefore follows that rationality must
Okay.
require a mind, because rationality is normative and normativity requires a
Yeah,
mind.
and actually, I like the topic of normative behavior. So in your conversion story, you bring this up. I hit this quote all the time, or I hit this concept all the time. You hit this concept all the time about morality. And so, from an atheist perspective, there is no normative moral behavior. There is no set way that morals could be, even though most of the time, like most atheists will use normative behavior and like their expectations about how people are to act, or they'll appeal to normative behavior whenever they're talking about people using different logical fallacies. But by them appealing to normative behavior, they're appealing to a way that things are to be. You and I agree that there is normative behavior and we have a philosophical grounding for it. However, atheists do not. Am I getting that right?
Well, yes and no. I would just say that because God does in fact exist, and there is in fact a moral standard, whether or not atheists want to acknowledge it or not, there is a normative standard. But the atheist should not affirm the standard. They don't have any justification for saying you did something wrong based on them being an atheist. But they are correct, strictly speaking, that when somebody murders somebody else, they have done something wrong. So when the atheist gets moral indignation about some tragedy, or some act of evil or whatever, I shouldn't have said tragedy probably, but
Mhm.
some morally terrible behavior by somebody, like somebody goes and shoots up a school and the atheist has moral indignation about it, they are correct on one hand because the person did in fact do something heinous and wrong and evil, but they're also incorrect on the other hand because on atheism they have no grounds for saying that the person did anything wrong because as you said, if atheism is true, there is no normativity. We have no obligations. There is no mind that has authority that is above us that is able to say you will obey, and if you don't then you are in the wrong. There's no transcendent mind, there's no transcendent authority. Think about being in a house without an owner, a house,
Mhm.
and it doesn't have smoke in the house, even if they're there arbitrarily for no reason, then you are not subject to those rules and you are not responsible to keep the rules on that wall because the rules are meaningless. The only way that you are subject to rules in a house is if the rules come from an owner, right? That's
Right.
it. If you go into an abandoned house, you can burn that thing down. Unless you live in a country, like unless the house is in a country with rules above you, right? And they say you're not allowed to, and I that is the world that we find ourselves in if atheism is true. We find ourselves in a world without an owner. So there is no rules that are above us that we are subject to.
I also
Period.
want to
Full
get this
stop.
because I kind of briefly touched on it. So as we're talking about normative behavior, it's not just the tragedy or people wronging people where atheists are appealing to normative behavior. They're appealing to normative behavior whenever they emphasize logical fallacies. So if you make an argument and an atheist says this includes logical fallacies X, Y,
Mhm.
or Z, they're appealing to normative behavior. Appealing to a normative structure of adhering to Aristotelian logic, which they can't really ground.
Part of my argument why you cannot get emergent minds because you've been asking me a few times now about like why can't evolution just get us
Mhm.
rationality. Well, one of the necessary preconditions, and I have responded to it, but I actually have 8 arguments against emergentism, and I probably will have about 12 before I write this book, maybe even 20, who knows, but I probably won't put them all in the book. But one of the main arguments that I think is the most powerful against emergentism is that when you think about what rationality is, one of the you have because trees also require something else, don't they? They require soil. They require sunlight.
Okay.
If you just had water, you still can't get a tree. But if you don't have water, you can't get a tree. So a tree requires more than just water, but it does require water, right? And in the same way, rationality requires a mind, but it doesn't just require a mind, it requires something else. It requires capital R reason. Because if there's no capital R reason, then what are we being rational towards? Where's the standard? There is no standard. So capital R reason is also necessary. But not only is capital R reason necessary for rationality to exist, so is normativity, because we have an obligation to be rational. So even if the atheist is correct that you can get a mind from evolution, you cannot get normativity towards a capital R reason without a mind. That has to come from a mind. And that, in my view, is game, set, match for this entire argument because you cannot get normativity and capital R reason from evolution. You can't get it. But if you do not have capital R reason and normativity, then there is no rationality. But my whole argument says that rationality does exist. You can't deny it. I haven't even gotten to that part though. But yeah, I don't know. Does that make sense
to
though?
that part.
Yeah. So the premise too is that rational certainty exists. And this premise is very easy to defend because you can't deny rational certainty without, sorry, I shouldn't say rational certainty. I should say the property of rationality exists. All right. So um, you can't deny that rationality exists without using rationality. All right. Because if I say rationality exists and you say, no, it doesn't, you're wrong, blah, 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 blah. Well, what are you doing?
You're using your rationality to deny the existence
Exactly.
of rationality.
Yeah. Right. So if I say, okay, is your rebuttal like using any reason whatsoever? Like, are you using your mind to reason? And is this in accordance with capital R reason? What you're saying right now, your refutation of me? If they say yes, it is, well, then they've just affirmed that they're being rational and that rationality exists. If they say no, it isn't, it has nothing to do with rationality, well, then why should anybody care about it? It's arbitrary.
What type of pushback? Because I think that would be the hardest one to push back against, that premise, rationality
Oh
exists.
yeah,
The
you
pushback have you
can't.
got on that one?
None. Because it's like trying to argue against truth, right? If I say that truth exists and somebody says no, it doesn't, I just say, okay, well, what is your rebuttal? And then they give me the rebuttal, and I say, okay, is your rebuttal true?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Or
Yeah.
imagine somebody trying to argue against logic. I say logic exists, and somebody says no, it doesn't, and then they start giving me the reasons, and I say, okay, um, is your refutation logical? If they say no, it isn't, then why shouldn't anybody care about it? And if they say yes, it is, then they've just affirmed the very thing that they're trying to deny. So rationality is true because in order to deny it, you have to affirm it. So it's true in the strongest sense of something being true. It's basically irrefutably true because to refute it, you have to use it. So it's basically the strongest sort of proof there is.
Yeah. No, it's no, it's a really strong argument. That's why I wanted some more people to hear about it.
Yeah. Yeah, hopefully more people
I'm just trying to think
will
of
pick
other
up
ways
on
I
it.
would try to challenge these arguments, and so I think you pretty well refuted the idea of evolution, bringing it about. Pretty well refuted someone using a more simple syllogism and like saying the flying spaghetti monster, therefore gravity. And I'm trying to think of other ways that I could try to tackle this. Like
I
for the
can tell
full
you what I think are the best hurdles for me to go through.
like for the full argument though,
Hmm.
I don't know if this is easy or hard for you to do, but what are maybe some of the better objections that you've received to these, and then how would you respond to those?
Yeah, in my view, there was an objection that argued that capital R reason is necessary for rationality. And this is actually what got me to realize that capital R reason and a mind are both necessary for rationality because the person was trying to argue that a mind isn't necessary for rationality, but only capital R reason is. And so there's a difference between something being necessary for something else to exist and sufficient for something else to exist. And so they were arguing that, well, you can get rationality from capital R reason, and so therefore you don't need a mind. And I said, no, you need both. You need both. If you have capital R reason, but you have no mind, you can't get rationality because rationality is the activity of a mind. So if there's no mind, you cannot get activity of a mind, right? And rationality is the activity of a mind. So you need capital R reason, and you need for there to be a mind. And you also need for the mind to somehow have a normative responsibility to actually be in accordance with capital R reason, which is really strange given atheism. And I do want to point that out. Um, basically, the atheist, they have to affirm that capital R reason exists, and capital R reason is all about how to think correctly. That's literally what it is. It's a standard of thinking. why
actually
in
appeal
the
to
world?
time, right? Like whenever,
What?
like when I was an
What's that?
atheist, like say, hey, that I am using reason, that right? That's what they say all
Yeah,
the time. It's that atheism is like the only
yeah,
belief or the only view, well, only perspective. I know that they wouldn't call it worldview, but only perspective where their foundation is reason. They only care about reason, the truth, what's rational, right? Those are things they appeal to all the
yeah. Well, when they say that they're using reason, they're talking about it in the verb sense, I think, most of the time.
time. Fair enough. Yeah.
And when what I'm talking about is I'm talking about the noun, like the noun of capital R reason, the thing that just exists. It's a standard, right? So standard is a noun, and then when we are reasoning, that's a verb, that's an activity, it's a thing that we are doing. So I'm talking about the noun, the standard of reason. And what I'm saying is that this noun, this standard of reasoning, is literally a standard for reasoning. But why, in the name of common sense, as David Wood would say, he loves saying that,
Mhm.
why on earth would it be the case on atheism that you would start with a metaphysic that doesn't have a mind, but is literally for thinking? Because the atheist has to say that capital R reason exists because rationality exists. I've proven that, and that's irrefutable. So if rationality exists, well, then necessarily the standard of reasoning, the capital R reason, the noun that I'm talking about, must exist. And that standard is all about how to think correctly. But why would there be a standard that exists for how to think correctly if you're starting without a mind as an atheist, which is where atheism starts? It says we're starting without a mind, because if they were starting with a mind, they'd be theists. So if you start
Mhm.
your reality without a mind, why in the heck is it baked into your reality normative ways of thinking? Like, what? That doesn't make any sense. So I
No.
think that this argument completely cooks atheism, frankly, and not a lot of people have realized it, but hopefully they do.
Yeah, that's what, yeah, I hope more people would realize it. Hey, I just wanted to ask real quick for the handful of people watching here. I'm going to let him, go into, any further expansion he wants to go into, starting to Daniel, you. But I also wanted to ask if anyone has any questions at all, um, as we approach towards the end of the conversation. If you have any questions at all you want me to ask them, you're welcome to process those. But for now, was there any other area that you wanted to expand that you think is really critical for anyone else listening right now?
Yeah, I do want to also talk about another argument that I have against emergentism. Like I said, I have eight, but I do want to talk about another one that I find really interesting. So the atheist is starting without a mind. They're saying there's no mind at the beginning of reality, right? So they're
Mhm.
automatically starting without any properties of mind. Because if they're starting with properties that can only come from a mind, then they're starting with a mind, right? So if they're, it wouldn't make sense for the atheist to say, I'm starting without a mind, but I'm also starting with rationality, or I'm starting without a mind, but I'm starting with normativity, right? Because rationality and normativity require a mind. So they can't start with any of the properties of a mind that minds have that make minds what they are. The atheist has to reject all of those from the beginning of their metaphysics. That would be like me starting my metaphysic and saying whatever is necessary for water to exist, I'm starting without that, right? So all the necessary properties that you have to have in order to get water, none of those exist in my metaphysic, because if they did, then I'm not starting with a waterlessness universe,
Yeah.
right? So like either you're starting with a watery universe or you're starting with not watery. And if you're starting with not watery, you don't get any of the properties of a watery universe. You have to start without those, right?
Mm.
Does that make sense what I'm saying so far? I feel like I'm being a little bit confusing right
It
now.
no, it does make a lot of sense, and I just want to just like one weakness I always like to point out with atheism and in the ways that they argue. They argue as if the mind, like a capital M mind exists, a capital R rationality exists. they argue like all these things exist. And there's this quote I know I always posted in your comments, and I like to use it on atheists all the time, from Stephen Hawking, that if our thoughts and actions are purely the result, it is hard to imagine how free will can exist if our thoughts and actions are purely a result of a natural process, which means that atheism begets determinism. That's from an atheist, Stephen Hawking. So then at that point, why are we engaged in this conversation, acting as if minds exist and acting as if there's an ultimate truth that we are pressing ahead towards? Not necessarily what
Yeah, so
what
that's the argument from reason. And I think that the argument from reason is really, really strong. But the argument from reason is not the argument that I'm making, because the argument from reason is just a good defeater for naturalism. Because it says if naturalism is true, then our minds are not the product of intelligent design. We're not made to reason. So why would we think that we could reliably depend on our reasoning? So that's a good defeat, including the belief that naturalism is true. But my argument, ontological, transcendental argument, which says if it is the case, when we talk about ontology, we're talking about things that exist in the way that they exist. I'm saying if rationality exists, then it must be the case that a necessary mind exists, aka God, and then rationality does exist, so therefore God exists. So this proves God directly instead of refuting naturalism like the argument from reason does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes. C.S. Lewis lays out the argument for rationality. If anyone wants to dig into that more,
I love that argument, by the way. I love these sort of arguments, but I actually think that this argument is stronger because it gets right to the heart of what God is, because God is ultimately a mind, and it shows that emergentism simply cannot account for rationality, but the atheist can't deny rationality exists. And I just think that this argument is insanely strong, frankly.
yeah,
The only
it's doing
well,
more than just completely undercutting naturalism, because you can completely
yeah.
undercut naturalism doesn't necessarily mean that there's a God, but your argument does more than that. It both undercuts naturalism and gives good grounding for the existence of God.
Yeah, and also shifts the burden of proof pretty successfully too, I think, because the atheist has to basically explain how they get rationality without God. And they can't, but they basically have to make an argument now, because I'm saying I can show why it can only come from God. So that requires them to show how it comes from not God. And they have a burden of proof to fill there, which is also great. I like to make them squirm a little bit, but I didn't really get to the point that I was trying to make, which is the contradiction. So what I was trying to say is that this argument against emergentism, when the atheist starts without a mind, they're starting without any of the properties that are necessary to get a mind. They're starting without rationality. They're starting without normativity. All of those necessary properties. They're starting without them. And then they're saying, without these properties being part of my universe, I'm still getting a mind. So imagine if I say that hydrogen and oxygen are necessary to get water. You can't get water without hydrogen and oxygen. And then I say, here's this universe over here, and I started without hydrogen and oxygen, and I got water. That's a
Yeah,
contradiction.
nonsense. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's what they have to do, because they have to start without a mind. Therefore, they have to start their metaphysic off without the properties of a mind. And if their reality starts without the properties of mind, and then they still get mind, that's like starting without the properties of water and saying you can't get water without these necessary properties, and then saying, hey, we got water. It's a contradiction. It's literally a metaphysical contradiction, because you're saying these things are necessary to get water, and yet we got water without these things. It can't be the case that something is necessary and not necessary at the same time, right? So if you can't get water without hydrogen, and you can get water without hydrogen, that's a contradiction. If you can't get rationality without mind, and you can get rationality without the properties of mind, that's a contradiction. So, but not only that, it's also, this is another argument that I think is really funny. They're also uh, and they're starting without those. So then whatever they're using to get mine is something extra and additional to the necessary properties that you have to get mined. So they're saying all the necessary properties, we're starting without those, but we're getting mined from other stuff, right? Because something's generating the mind. So they're literally going and adding they're taking away all the necessary stuff to get mined, and then they're throwing in other stuff that you shouldn't be able to get a mine from, and they're saying we got a mine from this.
Hmm.
you know it would be like, imagine somebody saying we live you can't get water without hydrogen and oxygen, and we live in a world with water, but there's no hydrogen and oxygen, but there's a bunch, and that's where we got the water from.
That's where it all came from. That's good.
It would be like, wait.
So you said you have like 8 or 9 more arguments then against, if I'm saying this wrong, emergentism.
Yeah.
Power through not all of them, but maybe like 1 or 2 more again, because I imagine that would be what most atheists would go to. Is, they would again, say that it's derived from evolution. I think you picked that apart a few different ways, but it sounds like you got a few a few more ways to pick it apart. So just go for it.
Yeah, the only issue is that I had to use my phone to do this, and I have my computer open, but I'm not sure if it's on my notes on my computer. My notes have been acting weird lately, so I can go to my phone, but I might. Let me try, and hopefully I don't lose you. Okay.
Yeah, no, it's all
Let's
right.
see.
Yeah, in order to invite you, I had to use my phone for it. I wanted to do it from my computer. It's kind of awkward doing it from my phone, but this is my first time trying to do it, and so I just go through it. But do what you can. He's pulling up notes, guys. Pulling up some good notes.
Okay. All right. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can.
Okay. When I went to my notes, you were not able to hear me, so I can go and look at my notes and find another one of the arguments, but I'm going to be quiet for like a minute. Do you want me to do that?
I think maybe not. I think I'll
I've
just
given you the strongest
at this.
arguments.
Hmm?
I said, in my view, the ones that I told you against emergentism, those are the strongest, but the other ones are very interesting. And those are not in my Substack. I haven't um, formally put those out yet, because I'm still working on them. I'm still developing them. But if I do write a book, which I probably will, they will definitely be in the book. And I do plan on publishing all that. I'm just kind of getting ready for a debate right now with Ben Watkins. He's the reason why I developed this argument in the first place. And once the debate is over, then I'm going to refocus my energies towards this argument.
Sure. Well, in that case, if it's good with you, I think we just kind of close it out here. This is, they've got the face on your screen with the voice talking about all this stuff. That's Darwin to Jesus on X and YouTube. And today he's laid out the rational argument for exist and went over some of the initial objections that I would think of for it. But he has this argument written extensively on these places, and then Substack. The Substack username also just Darwin to Jesus.
Yeah, it's the same thing. It's exactly right. And I would definitely recommend, if you want to read this long form stuff, you go to Substack. It's easier. And I just think it's better there. So,
Yeah, I just wanted to put it in video form to engage it in conversation there a little bit. But
oh, yeah,
hey, it
this is
was
great too.
fun.
Yeah, it was. I really appreciate you having me on and getting the opportunity to talk about this. I hope that a lot of people are able to watch this, and hopefully, I explained everything simple enough so that people, like normal people, can get it. That's what I try to do. My wife, she tells me, "You talk over people's heads all the time," and I'm like, "I'm really trying not to."
It's hard to know for sure, right? Because you don't know
Yeah,
the understanding that other people are coming into a conversation with,
right.
how familiar they might be with basic philosophy. It's kind of hard to know. But I think you lay it out easy enough for someone who, like, if someone's been following theology conversations for a while, which ideally they should be if they're telling the world that they're an atheist. Ideally, that person then has some type of grounding in philosophical concepts, but sometimes not so much. But
Well,
see, that
unfortunately, a
can
lot
kind of
of
depend on
the
how they react. But Darwin to Jesus Substack. Look up his Substack for the full for this argument and more on it, and we'll wrap it up here.
All right, sounds good.
Hey, peace, brother.
All right, have a good one.
You too.